Well, welcome everyone. This is a Cheetah House event of kind of the first one of its kind, where we are going to be talking about a new research study that is actually active and recruiting. And so I'm Willoughby Britton. I'm a researcher at Brown University, and I'm the director of the Clinical and Affective Neuroscience Lab there. I've been there for about 20 years, and I'm an associate professor of psychiatry in Brown University Medical School and an associate professor of behavioral and social sciences in the Brown School of Public Health. And my other colleague is going to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Roman Palitsky, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I am an assistant professor of psychiatry at Emory University, and I also serve as director of research projects in spiritual health, which is our chaplaincy service across 12 hospitals. And I've been collaborating with Willoughby on this work since, oh gosh, around 2020. So, yeah.
Roman also has a background in divinity. Do you want to just mention that briefly? It's kind of relevant.
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. So, part of my winding path was before I became a psychologist, before I started that training, I also have I obtained a Master's of Divinity from Harvard University. And a lot of what I do is really at the intersection of those two areas of spirituality and existential concerns on one hand, and clinical care, especially sort of at the intersection of psychological and medical issues on the other. So that's really a lens that I bring to a lot of the work that I end up doing nowadays, and that very much includes this project that we'll be talking about.
So I recognize some of the faces here, and I realize that many of you are very informed about everything that we've done in the research lab. But I'm going to speak to those of you who are new and are not aware of anything in the past. So I'm gonna start at the beginning. And give you a little bit of background as to how this new study came about. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to go into the varieties of contemplative experience study. That was a mixed methods study on meditation-related challenges that my lab conducted between 2007 and 2017. It actually took 10 years. That was a mixed method study that was primarily interview-based. So it was a qualitative study, and we really focused on three particular questions, which are phenomenology. So what types of meditation-related challenges did you have, with a really rich description there? How did you make sense of them? And what were the influencing factors that, determined or influenced the severity or the trajectory? And that includes, why do you think this happened to you? So risk factors. And also, what did you do about it? So remedies. And we interviewed 68 meditators about their own experience. And we also interviewed a number of teachers about how they manage difficulties in their students. And so, like I said, it took 10 years. In the end, we had over 100 interviews, 3,000 pages of transcripts, and we came up with 59 categories of meditation-related challenges with 26 influencing factors. We have a bunch of papers. If you're interested in reading them, I can put the link to them in the chat. I think there's at least 12. There was an overview paper that describes the 59 categories. We have a paper on different types of phenomenology. So fear and terror, which was our most common one. Having the list here. Changes in sense of self. Two papers on energy-like somatic experiences. A paper on visual lights or hallucinations. Delusion-like ideation. The question of progress or pathology, or the differential diagnosis criteria that teachers use to determine whether intervention is warranted. So when is it part of the path and when is it something that needs a different kind of support? We also looked at influencing factors, specifically the role of the teacher, which that paper just came out. We have a paper on looking at diet. How does diet play a role? And we have two papers on worldview. Generally, how does worldview play a role in this whole thing? And also specifically on how are people using religion and science to explain or interpret these experiences, and how do those relate to each other? Because it was a qualitative study, mostly interview-based, we did have a brief follow-up survey at the end, but it was mostly interviews. There's a lot of limitations to that particular methodology. So it's a very appropriate methodology when you don't know something about an area, when it's a new area of research. So we got a lot of really rich descriptions from people who had the experience. But there's a lot of questions that we need a different kind of methodology to answer. And so probably the $1,000,000 question is, how often does this happen? So frequency is not something that you can really get a good, accurate estimate of frequency when you're asking 100% of your sample has had a meditation related challenge. So that's not really going to get you very accurate frequencies of meditation related challenges writ large, but it's also not going to tell you which types of experiences are the most frequent. We have a guess, but nothing definitive. We also don't know how different types of experiences, these 59 categories, might interact with each other or cluster together. In my clinical experience at Cheetah House, I've seen over 1,000 meditators in distress. So I have some hypotheses about how different, I see kind of patterns of symptoms going together. But again, that's not data, that's just my clinical impression. Which types of experiences are the most problematic? Which ones should we worry about as teachers, as clinicians? And which ones do we think, oh, those don't usually typically, get worse or lead to impairment? What is the clinical footprint? So what type of information do we need to inform clinicians with less background? And then we have some subjectively reported, so why do you think this happened to you? People report their impression about why it happened to you, but that's not a statistically, mathematically determined risk factor. And so with a different type of study, we can actually calculate mathematically, statistically, risk factors. And also a lot of people, have an idea that certain types of remedies help. And we know that we are very good at deceiving ourselves about whether they actually do. And so a different type of study would be able to measure that more accurately. And then influencing factors. So what factors influence the severity or duration? One thing that we've learned at Cheetah House is that the difficulties themselves, so things like, panic or hallucinations or, the main sort of symptoms, that's only one piece of this. And that a lot of people have reported that the way that people responded to their reporting, their disclosure of their experiences, was a very big determiner, influencing factor as to what happened next and how much suffering they had. So that's a big area of our study coming up. We really want to open that and see really what are the social factors, how are teachers responding, how are friends responding, how are clinicians responding, how is that playing a role? We also really want to know what helps. As someone who has an entire organization trying to help people, I'm hoping that it's helping, but you can't ask people who are your patients if it's helping. You have to get anonymous feedback, because nobody wants to tell you actually what you're doing isn't really helping. So that's a big question that we have. We also know that a lot of the sort of default remedies that a lot of teachers are putting out there um, are actually a lot of, at least for some people, actually making things a lot worse. So we really need more data on that. And maybe a better question or a better way to frame that isn't like what works, but like what works for who, because obviously there's a large range of some people really benefit from certain approaches and other people, it makes other people worse. So we really want to see if, is there any way to predict what's going to be the best approach rather than just having to guess? And so these are just some of the questions that have been, pretty much we've been encountering them all along during the VCE study, but also, since then. And so we actually started creating scales or looking for existing scales that could answer some of these questions. We started looking for this in 2017. So it's been 7 years or so, 8 years that we've been kind of looking into this. And some of the questions, it's a complicated area. And so some of the questions, there were no existing scales that could really get at what we wanted to ask. And so we actually did something called community-based participatory research, where we actually reached out to meditators in distress and asked them, what kind of questions should we be asking? What do you want to make sure we capture in this survey so that your experience is represented? And they had some input on some of the questions. So this has been a very, very long process. And I'm very excited that we've actually gotten to the finish line and are actually recruiting. But there was an interesting extra twist on this particular study, which is that it's not a single arm study. It's actually a parallel arm study, and the other arm is measuring psychedelic related challenges. So that was a bit of a surprise, and I'm going to let Roman walk us through how we got there.
Yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of autobiographical, they say theory is biography and research is me search, and that's definitely true here. My first encounter with your work, Willoughby, was in, I think, 2012, when you gave this big talk at Mind and Life. I think that was the year. About the VCE project, and I really, really wanted to talk to you and Jared, and there was just a really big line and I didn't get a chance to. So I looked closely. I read all the papers that I could, and I was a graduate student very soon after. And the thing that kept coming up for me was like, well, okay, if I want to learn to be a clinician who can address this stuff, who can sort of provide care for folks who show up with meditation related challenges, what do I need to do? What should be in my toolkit? And I think a lot of those questions, especially the program that I was in, was very like biobehavioral. It was very like, we're very evidence-based with a capital E and a capital B, right? So we really, we wanted the clinical interventions that were tied to symptoms and syndromes and outcomes. And so fast forward coming into Willoughby's lab as a postdoc, this was like the question at the top of my mind, right? Is how do we measure this in a way that can translate into our sort of clinical practice of people who really don't know much about this stuff? Um, and going through several years of designing this study and thinking about how do we do this as best as possible, I think it was during that time that people started to show up at Cheetah House who were saying, well, so I'm having the kind of symptoms, the kind of challenges you're talking about, but it's not from meditation. It's because I took a psychedelic and I tried looking everywhere and I'm not finding any resources. And the only place I can find somebody who understands what I'm going through is this meditator resource, right? Is this meditator organization. And so could you guys help me? And I think a lot of the time, it was like, well, we don't know all that much about psychedelic related challenges and side effects. But over and over, it seemed like there was this pattern of effects that had the kind of spread, from somatic to existential to worldview, and also these kinds of clinical episodes, right? That I think somebody who's just completely naive to this stuff, somebody presents and say, "Oh, it looks like you're having a manic episode," right? Um, that kind of initial presentation as well, right? We would see sometimes, and so as as I continued, after I became faculty at Emory, I was still very interested in this study, but I think this issue that animated the creation of the two arms is one is that we have these two populations that are describing very similar syndromes. And the other is people keep asking you for a control condition. People keep asking you for like, we had this recently in a challenges study. Like, well, but don't these things happen on their own anyway, right? Like, isn't that kind of how do we know that it's due to meditation or anything like that? And there's no really ethical way you could randomize people to having meditation related challenges, right? We'd get in trouble for that. So we borrow from epidemiology. And what they do in epidemiology is they will look for a naturalistic comparator some of the time. Let's say, okay, is there a kind of a natural condition or syndrome where there's a very, like a similar profile, but it's due to a different cause? And maybe by having a comparator, we can actually understand what are the unique causal factors, what are the unique determinants of these trajectories. And so, because of all this work, because of all this background, and then we started to dig further into it, meditation and psychedelic related challenges really emerged as these two kind of Goldilocks comparators for one another. Um, uh, Not just because of what people report, but because of the social context, right? In both social contexts, people kind of have this, there's a group of people who want to treat it more scientifically, like a technique or like a sort of just a compound, if you're talking about psychedelics. And then there's people who really treat it as a spiritually relevant and important practice that's a part of a journey, right? And so you're dealing with this kind of social environment, right? That you can't take out the way that you would be able to if you were just looking at like side effects of antidepressants or SSRIs, right? So that's really what led to the genesis of this two-arm approach. So not only are we doing this for meditators, but we have this second companion arm where we're really asking almost the same, it is slightly tweaked in some cases, but almost the same questions, same design, same structure for people who report psychedelic related challenges. So that, yeah, Willoughby, did you have something to add?
Well, the other thing that I've noticed is that these two worlds are not independent. They overlap a lot.
Yeah.
And so, I also noticed at Cheetah House in the last 5 years or so, and definitely in a growing way, that the meditators that showed up had a psychedelic story that was overlapping. And so often, they tried to use psychedelics to recover from their meditation related, symptoms, and that had certain kinds of consequences. And or vice versa, people had, they went on an ayahuasca retreat and were very dysregulated, and their therapist told them to go on a meditation retreat to recover from that. And that also had some interesting consequences. So I was like, okay, there's like these things are overlapping. And now like there are entire organizations where psychedelics are being offered on meditation retreats, and meditation is being offered as an integration to psychedelics. So there's a lot of overlap. And, in some cases, I'm seeing a lot of the same names like popping up as they were meditation teachers and now they're in the psychedelic world. And so I think there's a tremendous overlap that could be leveraged potentially for support, that you don't have to create two separate support systems. It's possible that we could be, integrating support that could be available for both groups. So that's a possibility. So I think we just need to know more about what's out there.
And I just added for the folks who are here in the Zoom call, I added a link to an article by Rachel Peterson from the Harvard Divinity
Hmm.
Bulletin called A Theological Reckoning with Bad Trips. And it's actually, I think it's a beautifully written article. And it describes her like this sort of overlap where she was a participant in a psilocybin trial And then she went on a meditation retreat. And really, her difficulties were kind of this sort of constellation, like really the synergy of what happened doing one thing and then the other. So yeah.
And if you start to go down the Rachel Peterson rabbit hole, she also gave a talk at Cheetah House about not only her experience that she talks about in the article, but also what happened after she wrote the article. Because one of the other things that is a relevant piece in this whole experience is just what, when you speak out about your experience, what happens to you? Because there can be a lot of different kinds of responses to people who speak out. So let's talk about the study. And so the initial formation of the questions did start at Brown in my lab, but now it's basically being run out of Emory. And then we also have some other collaborators. So Roman, walk us through who's actually involved. And yeah, who are these researchers?
So this is a fairly large team that was assembled because of just incredible expertise in the specific areas that we were hoping to draw upon. So first of all, the researchers from Brown University are just absolutely critical to everything that we're doing. Nicholas Canby, I think, is just not only just a brilliant content expert on non-ordinary states of consciousness and addressing sort of when things go not as desired with both arms of the study, psychedelics and meditation. But also just one of the most exceptional statistical minds I've had a chance to work with. So really a great collaborator for the study. Um, but also here at Emory, we have a few researchers who are really helping us uh, go a little bit further with this study than I think we've seen in any study of challenges or adverse effects. Actually, not just in meditation or psychedelics, but really there is no study of SSRIs out there that is doing this kind of due diligence. There's no study of like cognitive behavioral therapy challenges that has done this kind of diligence. So, for example, one of the researchers on this team is Deanna Kaplan, and she is an expert in ambulatory assessment. And so ambulatory assessment allows that's when you go outside of the clinic and outside of the self-report sometimes. So you're not just answering a survey on your computer, but you're letting people know how things are going for you as you go about your ordinary daily life. And so the subset of participants, and I'll talk about this later, but a subset of the participants in our study, we're going to be asking them every week as they're going through their process of like recovering, hopefully from challenges, just to talk into their phone and give us a stream of consciousness about how it's going. So this, I think, is going to be a lot of the time we're sort of locked into these standardized measures that we have. And what we hear from participants a lot of the time is that doesn't really fit my experience. Like I answered your question about depression or whatever, but that's not the best way to understand what's been happening to me. So this really gives us a sense to listen to participants in their own words, but also to do it in a sort of a week to week to week to week way where you can really see the ups and downs and really see what's relevant for them as time goes on. So that is really thanks to Deanna Kaplan. We also Jessica Maples Keller, who is really more of an expert on the psychedelic side of what we're talking of what we're doing. She's a researcher who's done multiple MDMA trials and is also one of the leading experts in PTSD and trauma at Emory University. And so she's helping us to also formulate that side of the symptom clustering. One of our, I think, we've got like a sort of a core team here. And it's actually an alliance of really three centers. So there's Brown, there's Emory, but the third one is at the University of Melbourne. and that's their Contemplative Science Center. And Nicholas Van Dam, who has been also just really doing cutting edge work to understand the varieties of meditative experiences. Um, and he and his team have been a part of the design of this study, helping us to conceptualize what we're doing. They're going to be really crucial for the analysis as well. Um, a major part of this study, Willoughby mentioned sort of looking at how symptoms cluster, right? So I also have some suspicions, right, that we're not necessarily just looking at one thing here, right? That there's going to be the person who's like, based on my experience, reporting something that looks a lot like PTSD, for example, right? And there's going to be the person who's reporting something that looks a lot like a manic episode, right? Again, sort of in my kind of maybe traditional psychiatry lens, right? There's going to be somebody who's really going through a spiritual crisis, and that's really the way that we can maybe best conceptualize what's happening to them. Um, there is, measuring and understanding how these things cluster, how symptoms cluster is a field unto itself. And we have a collaborator from the University of North Texas, Holly Levin Aspenson, who is really helping us understand the symptom clustering and understand sort of what are the profiles of that people present with. And there's a really clear deliverable from that, which is that at the end of this study, we'll be able to hopefully have a concise, brief assessment that can really just query, what is happening with this person who's presenting with this with difficulties, and what kinds of sort of symptom clusters, symptom profiles do they have. And it's very likely, I think, that we're going to find that different, when Willoughby says what works for whom, that's going to depend on which clusters they're presenting with. Right. So if insomnia is a big part of what you're experiencing, that might be different from somebody who is presenting with kind of let's say more of a dissociative type of experience where insomnia is not really a big part of it, for instance. So those are our kind of our major members of our research group. But really, gosh, for me, this study, I think, is easily the most important study I've ever worked on. Um, it's the most ambitious study that I've ever worked on, which is like a little bit of it's a double-edged situation. Working on a very ambitious project means that if it works, like if you really get to do the things you hope to, you really get to make something impactful and that can improve people's lives. But it will really ride on whether or not we can find people who can participate in the study. And so, in addition to our core team, we have this extensive kind of group of sort of community stakeholders, organizations, folks that we're really hoping can help us spread the word and become recognizable as a study, as an initiative, who are sort of, partners in a lot of other ways, even though they're not on the core research team.
And we'll circle back to that during the Q&A because maybe you can help us spread the word. Hopefully many of you will also participate, but I'm going to jump into, I'm actually just going to read the official study objectives, which are on the website. So the first one is to observe and describe the nature, longitudinal course, duration, and impact on functioning of meditation-related challenges. To identify factors that influence trajectories and outcomes of meditation-related difficulties. To ascertain the extent to which meditation and psychedelic-related challenges overlap and differ in their types, longitudinal course, duration, and impact. We also gave you a ton of other things that we're interested in, but those are the official ones on the website. So now I want to kind of move into who are we looking for? How do I qualify? And like, what does the study entail? And so what are the inclusion criteria? So who are we looking for? Roman?
So we're looking for uh, uh, traditionally this would be called an enriched sample, right? Which means that we're looking for folks who have the who have the issue that we're trying to understand, right? Folks who are experiencing the problem that we're hoping to get our to wrap our minds around. So again, this won't really tell us much about frequency because everybody in our study is going to be somebody who has experienced meditation related challenges. Um, so it's really anybody who has had a meditation related challenge that has persisted beyond kind of an acute, brief meditative state, right? So if you had a one meditation session and you got pretty sad, but afterwards you were just fine, no big deal, kind of, that's probably that's less it, right? But if the next day you continued to experience difficulties, anybody with um, distress or impairment that persisted into your life for any amount of time, we would be interested in hearing from you. Um, we've been hearing from some folks who say, well, I got better. Do you still want to hear from me? Absolutely. Absolutely, we want to hear from you. Because really what we're trying to understand here, some people like many issues, right? So I think the good news is that people tend to recover. But we want to understand what it is that helps people recover, right? What it is that contributes to these issues dragging on. So, so half of our sample, half of the 800 people that we're recruiting, would be folks who have experienced these challenges relatively recently. So within like the last 3 months, because that half we're going to ask if we can follow for a year. And we want to know the ups and downs of how it's been going. The other half is really at any point in your life, right? So if you have had challenges at any point in your life in the past and you can recollect them, then we'd like to hear from you because also we don't want to bias our sample by saying, well, we only want to hear from people who are right in the midst of it. We want to know whether looking back 10 years from then, right? What was your how have things shaken out, right? Where did this land for you in your life narrative? That's really important too, and we don't want to miss that component.
So I'm going to read the inclusion criteria, and the use of and or is actually really important here. So I want you to clarify this because I didn't write down which one it was.
Hmm.
So one, you've had a difficult or distressing meditation related challenge that persisted beyond the acute and meditative state. Is this an or negatively impacted your life and daily functioning?
Yes.
Or required additional treatment or support. So it could be something that you had one time during one meditation session, but if it scared the out of you, then and you now have PTSD symptoms and you had to go to a psychiatrist for that, that would count, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because
Oh,
you
yeah.
had to get extra support and it last, yeah. Um, so, and then right now we're doing only English speaking, or at least being able to speak English well enough to read in English, right?
Yeah. You would need to be able to have English proficiency to go through the consent process. And in order to be able to sort of relatedly understand all the items and measures. I don't know if this is the time to talk about why, but there is a why.
Let's hold off on that and let's just get through the criteria. So, um, you need to be 18 or hot or older. And right now, you need to be, this is a really important one. You need to be residing in the US. And this may change in the future. So can you tell us a little bit about the sort of other area? Because we have an international sample here right here on this call. So People might be pretty bummed to hear that it's only the US right now, and where other areas might come on the map soon.
So, probably in this order, the next country that we will include in the study is Canada, and then Australia, and then potentially the UK. Um, and Europe would probably follow. Yeah, and there's really kind of boring regulatory reasons for for this. But yeah.
Okay. So if I wanted to participate in this, how would I do it? What's the exact procedure? So first there's a screener, which is very brief, and we'll see whether I qualify. And so walk us through, this is not maybe the typical order, and there's very good reasons for why we did things this way, but walk people through, like, there's a screener, and we provide an email, and then we get an email back to invite us to be part of a follow-up 10-minute video interview.
Yeah.
Um, why are we doing that?
Yeah. So again, the steps, right? The steps are you go to the website or through a link directly to the screener, answer. It's just a handful of questions. It should take a minute, right? And put an email address where we can contact you. And then we'll reach out to you and say, hey, let's sign up for a screener. What's a good time for you? And that would be the video interview. We are talking to every single person who is participating in this study. All 1,600 people we're having one-on-ones with. There's two reasons for this. One is it's an online study and we're paying people, which means that the bots are out to get us. Um, there's sort of a cottage industry of folks who participate in online studies just to sort of get the compensation, who may not have any actual relevance to the study itself. So having run a number of these studies, you know, I've done a study about like attitudes toward, I don't know, just a kind of the last one was about the psychedelic related study. And people come in and say, "Oh yes, I'm very interested in your HIV study." And it's like, well, that's not what we're doing, you know? So what I've learned is that with the advent of generative AI and all of the GPTs out there, they can pretty much outsmart any hack you put into the survey to sort of catch people. And we're kind of going old school, right? Low tech. We're just talking to people, and it doesn't take long. It's just a brief conversation, but really just to sort of get a sense, touch base that yes, this is a real human being, and they have a they have there's a reason why they want to participate in this study. Um, we're not going to be going deeply into the challenges that you might have experienced in these conversations because these are only 10 to 15-minute conversations. We don't want to kind of unearth a bunch of difficult emotional experiences and then not be able to sort of uh, f walk along with the person who's on the other end of the line for that call, right? So it's a little bit superficial, right? We're just gonna ask, you know, kind of what brings you to the study, that kind of stuff. Um, but the other reason that we're doing this is we actually like we recognize like most people who participate in this study aren't doing it for the $30, right? They're doing it because they are contributing something deeply personal and meaningful. And we feel like we owe it to every single person who's in our study to be there on the other end of the line. And so that they know who's working on the study, so they have a chance to ask us any specific questions that they have. And to know that if things come up down the line and they have more questions, they understand that our team is going to be responsive to them. And that's just part of our commitment. So that call helps establish that too. Um, yeah. Then,
Yeah.
assuming the call has gone well, and assuming that, you know, again, it's not a person who's just kind of running a study participation mill, but they have the life experience that we're seeking, then we would follow up and send a study link to participate in the study.
So this is kind of a Q&A, but since we're on it, I'll just do it now. So my email is willoughby.britton@gmail.com. So when I send you my email or I enter my email, like you know who I am. And then when I pop up like to interview with your staff, like here I am, like obviously you know who I am. So how like that makes me nervous. Like how are you going to protect people's, this is supposed to be anonymous.
Yeah.
So it doesn't feel that anonymous. Like how is these few steps right here, how are you going to protect people's privacy?
So there's a couple of things that we do. One is even in the screener, right? We suggest that if this is something you care about, there's a way to create an email that's anonymous. And you can do that just if you don't want like even anything that's connected to you in the screening process. The other piece, and this has actually come up a couple of times as we've been doing these screeners, is a lot of our screeners are done by our study team, which is mostly students in my lab. And these folks, generally speaking, they won't know the vast majority of people in the study. But so for example, I'm there to train our team. So I will be on the call as well, especially in these early days. And I've had an experience of like knowing the person who was on the other end of the line. It's been a surprise to me. It's like, oh, hey, we know each other. Um, so what I've done in those cases is actually said, nice to see you. Before we ask you anything, I'm going to leave the call because I should not know the things that you'll be mentioning, even if it's incidental, right? I want this to be private. So, and this is a rule for our team that anytime you think that there might be a personal connection or a way that you might know who the other person is, if you need to, you can even reschedule the screening so that there is anonymity. We don't record those calls. We don't retain any information from those conversations. It's really just it's very informal, that part of it.
Great. I have a couple other questions about that later, but I'll bring them up in the Q&A. So, okay, so I have the link now to start the study. So what's in the study? So technically this study design is a longitudinal observational design, and there's actually 4 different ways you could participate in this study. So I want to go through each one. The first one is a retrospective survey. So this is for the person who's had a meditation related challenge at some point in their life, anytime. It takes about 2 hours. And so we'll go through exactly what is in that. The second way is an interview. So that would be like on an online interview with a member of the staff. And that's about an hour. And then the third way is actually collecting data across time, so longitudinally for 1 year. That would be 6 30-minute surveys. And that's only for people who have had a recent challenge. And then the fourth way is the FABLA voice diary. So I'm going to go through each one of these individually. So for the survey, and this is the one that I spent the most time making, we have a section on demographics. So that's pretty much what it sounds like: age, gender, race, sexual orientation, education, religious affiliations, country of origin, socioeconomic status, um, meditation history, types of practices, amount, that type of thing. Pre-existing influencing factors, so things that like personal or family psychiatric illness or trauma history, adverse childhood experiences, set and setting questionnaire used to assess person level, treatment level, like dose, contextual factors. Was there a teacher? Was there a sangha that were present at the time of onset? Obviously, we're going to ask a lot of detailed questions about the challenges themselves. What were they like? Um, how much they were related to impairment and functioning. And then post difficulty influencing factors, responses, and remedies. So influencing factors that occurred after or in response to the onset of difficulties, responses from others, appraisals from participants. So how did you make sense of it? What types of remedies did you attempt and how well did they work? A lot on impacts and outcomes. So how did it impact your functioning? Was there any hospitalization, medical treatment, psychotropic medications? Um, was there any employment or disability, harm to self or other, involvement in law enforcement, etc.? There's a causality assessment, which is basically like, well, how do you know that meditation was the cause? Good question, actually. And so there's a long meditation causality assessment. So if you're not sure, you can still participate in the study. The causality assessment will kind of determine whether you qualify after the fact. Um, yeah, so that is the 2 hour survey. And we'll get into the compensation after we kind of go through the procedure, but yeah, walk us through the interview part. So that was the part I was involved with, was this massive survey. And then the rest was actually Roman created. So I'm going to let him walk us through those pieces. Tell us about the interview.
Yeah, do you mind if I just backtrack a little bit to the
Yeah.
survey? Because I think again, this comes up in our conversations, and maybe since I'm talking to the folks going through the study so much, um, an hour to 2 hours, that is a long time. We recognize that. It's a big contribution. And so part of it is, why we are asking so many things. And um, what I have found is that a lot of the existing studies of meditation related difficulties and challenges, um, the ones that are not these kinds of extensive qualitative studies like Willoughby has done, they are so on the surface level. We really have a hard time learning clinically meaningful, interpersonally significant, like actionable information from that. And, we get like, oh, well, it was challenging and it persisted for a week. Okay. And what else, right? Like what do we do with this information? And so we have put a lot of the years of work on this study have really been around what is the minimum number of things we need to know in order to be able to take actionable steps forward. So every single thing that's in that survey is stuff that we really, really care about and we think is really important to know so that we can derive next steps. But it is making a big ask. So some of the things that we've built into the study are, for example, a recommendation like, hey, listen, take care of yourself. Take breaks, right? Some of the stuff we ask you about are going to be personally meaningful and significant. I've talked to some participants who are like, oh, I needed to pause and kind of process. Please do that, right? You can step away, you can come back to the survey. You've got a month to complete the whole thing, right? Take your time. So and we will be sending you check-ins. So even if you're like, oh, but what if I forget? Like, hopefully you won't. And if our team sees that a survey is midway sort of not complete, we'll check in with you and say, hey, just a reminder, anything that you need from us to help you complete this, right? But the idea is we know it's long, we know it's a big lift. So thank you for anybody who participates, and do take your time. There's also part of the survey where you can upload your own narrative, your own story. You can type it into a box, but I've been finding that that some of the people who are wanting to participate in the study, they're just like emailing me and saying, here's my experience. And you get an email with a couple of pages of writing. And that's really valuable. That's really, really important. It's more than we would think to ask. But if you have that, and it turns out that a lot of people actually do, um, maybe upload it to us and we will absolutely use that information. So there's also that piece because again, kind of like with the voice diary, we know that some of what we're asking you, like it's hard to fit your experience into a box. And so if you have that narrative, we definitely would love to have it as well. Okay, interviews, right? So for this study, again, it's sort of part of my orientation as a researcher, right? I think anytime we have quantitative data, we are going to have questions that emerge out of it that are hard to make sense of just by the numbers. What is really happening for these people who are reporting this sort of profile, right? We want to talk to those folks. We want to understand what their experiences were like. So the interviews are going to be a way to, again, get a kind of a sense qualitatively. What has your experience been like? What have been some of the key features of it? What helped, right? The sort of consistent with the earlier varieties of contemplative experiences project, but it's going to play a key role in this study because hopefully it'll let us follow up and say, okay, we're seeing this in the data, we're seeing this in the numbers, but we want to know what it's actually been like for people who have had that kind of experience, right? Who have had, maybe a mild challenge, let's say tinnitus, right? So like this is my go-to example. If somebody has a buzzing in their ear and it's not really a big deal if it lasts a couple days for most people. But imagine it lasts a year or two, then it's like really debilitating potentially. So we want to know what that has been like for some of the people, right? That doesn't get represented easily in the numbers. Um, so that's uh, one of the reasons that we're doing these qualitative interviews is just to get more detail. Should I talk about the longitudinal part?
Yep, go ahead.
Um, the other, so something that is a bit of a pet peeve of mine is we will often ask people kind of like, what led to improvement? What led to worsening? How did things turn out for you? And, if you've talked to a person who's generally chipper and upbeat, and even after a bad thing happens to them, right, a few years later, they'll like, oh, it was fine. It was, sure, it was kind of hard sometimes, but it all turned out for the best, right? That doesn't always tell us how bad it was when it was really bad, right? And so you get this sort of retrospective bias that we all have, right? It's just part of the way that we tell the stories of our lives. And so we wanted to be able to see how these challenges unfold, right? Um, the medical term I use for this sometimes is chronicity, right? So these different syndromes, right? Again, most people, the good news is that generally speaking, most people recover, and that's great. Um, and we want to understand the factors that influence that recovery. So this is a way of assessing, right? So let's say you did have a meditation related challenge and somebody told you, you know, looks like an antidepressant is the best approach, right? And so then you took that antidepressant and did you get better or didn't you? Right? In the scheme of things, looking back, you might say, oh, sure, I took an antidepressant and it was great. I improved, right? But we want to be able to say, okay, so at month 3, you started taking an antidepressant, and at month 4, you were feeling better, right? And if that happens by and large for many of our participants, then we can start to understand overall whether the medication is helping and who it's helping. That's really the purpose of the longitudinal study is to really start to get a sense. It's not the same thing as a randomized study. It's not quite causality, but it's the closest I think that we can get with a study like this to understanding what actually helps people recover.
Great. And so the last piece is the Fabla voice diary. Tell us about what that is and what it's like.
So that is it's a part of the study that we're actually bringing online in the next probably in the next month or so. Um, it's something that I'm really excited about. Fabula is the name of the app. Um, it's a research app, so it allows us to. Do you ever like send a voice memo to your friends, right? Instead of texting, kind of make a recording and send it to them. That's kind of the birth of this app was the researcher who designed this, Deanna Kaplan, was like sending voice memos back and forth to a friend, and it turned out to be richer than, any of the sort of self-report little fill in the bubbles measures that she had seen. It's like, well, I want to use this as a researcher. Right. But of course, those are not they're not compliant with regulatory standards. They're not confidential. There's a lot of issues with that. So there she ended up creating a specialized app. That app is called Fabla. And what it lets you do, and what you'll be doing if you participate in this study, is you would download this app onto your phone. We don't collect any sort of peripheral data. There's no metadata. It's a pure research app. And once a week, it'll ask you a couple of kind of general questions. You could get through it in like, less than 5 minutes. And then it'll say, just talk into the app. Tell us what it's been like for you. And speak, if you can, try to speak for 5 minutes without stopping. And what that really helps us get is your own stream of consciousness experience, the ups and downs, and also importantly, in this generation of research, we've got this stuff called um, acoustic biomarkers. So you go to the doctor and they'll take your heart rate, right? Or they'll take your blood pressure, right? These are standard biomarkers. But there are certain things you can pull out of people's speech patterns, like depression. Depressed people tend to speak slower. There's less up and down in the voice. It's more monotonous, right? Um, and that is some additional, really important features that we can pull out of those voice diaries. And what we hope that'll help us do is again really better understand what the daily and weekly experiences are like, so that we can have a really nice granular approach. Um, and because these will be with folks who are going through the acute kind of the very recent challenges, um, it lets us correct any misperceptions that we have based on the self-report about, what are the numbers telling us that we uh, that isn't coming through in people's own voices that we need to make sure that we get right.
Okay, and to the important part, which is the compensation. Um, so you are paying people, and depending on which of the four things you're doing, you can get paid a different amount. So for the retrospective survey, which is an hour to 2 hours, what's the compensation for that?
So the retrospective survey, which is really the key to participating in the entire study, that's $30. And that comes in the form of an Amazon gift card.
And for the meditation arm, we're expecting 800 people.
Hmm.
For that arm, 800 for the psychedelic arm. Okay, for the interview,
That is $40.
and we're expecting for the meditation arm 60 people to do the interview. So much smaller group doing the interview. The longitudinal 1 year, 6 30-minute surveys. This is more complicated. Yeah.
So basically you get there's compensation every time you fill out one of these longitudinal surveys, starting at $10 for the first one. And then we add $3 for every next survey that you would take. The reason for that is we know doing this for a whole year, 6 times, it's a big commitment. So we want to kind of really reward and appreciate, how that somebody keeps coming back to it. So the very last of the 6 surveys would be $25.
And that's for people who have had a recent challenge in the last year. Is that about?
More recent than that,
More
hopefully.
recently.
Yep. So we're really trying to start with folks within the last 3 months. But also I think for some folks, I think it'll be useful to know if these challenges do persist beyond a year, how it continues to go. So we might expand that window.
Okay, so there's 400 people in the longitudinal uh, part, which means that there'll be 400 people with very recent difficulties. So we hope there's, or we don't hope because that means that there's a lot of difficulties happening right now. But given how many people I see a week, I think there actually are. Okay, and then the voice diary, what's the compensation for that?
So that is oh gosh. I might actually need to come back to you for that because we're still in the
Oh,
in the
still uploading that one. Okay.
yeah, yeah. So uh
Okay, so I have two final questions before we get into the Q&A. So I'm totally stoked to do the study. Obviously, I can't do the study, but I am speaking on behalf of what you guys might be thinking. I'm totally stoked to do the study, but like I really want to write my own like my story first. So I want to like do that. Like how much time do I have before I can like how much time do I have to write my story before I can like jump in? Like how long is this study gonna go?
oh, well, this study's going for 3 years. So really till the summer of 2028, which please don't put off participating. Especially because, we know that as time goes on, our memory kind of does its work, hopefully in a positive way. Hopefully everybody's getting better and improving, and that's wonderful. But the further out we are from the events, the blurrier it can get sometimes.
And once it hits 800, is it gonna close or
In theory, I think that there's a possibility that we might get some additional funding to, if we hit our goal early, to expand our sample. But right now the plan is that 800 is what we think will be enough for this study.
okay, so how do I start? How do I sign up?
Well, we have first of all, we have a website that was developed by our team here at Emory. Um, and I believe that it's called let's see, meditationchallenges.org. What is it? Meditation Challenges Study. Yeah, meditationchallenges.org. That's it. Um, so 2 words altogether, no punctuation. Uh, and that'll take you to the study website. There's a link for how to participate. There should also be a link on Cheetah House, I think.
Yep, so if you go to the research tab on Cheetah House and then like the drop down menu says participate in research, you can just go through that way if you forget that it's meditationchallenges.org. Okay, so we're gonna open it up to Q&A. I have a couple questions that are probably like frequently asked questions. So the first, and so get your questions ready. You can put them in the chat or you can just raise your hand. So I can understand being a little bit nervous about giving this kind of data. Um, Basically report whistleblowing on someone, feeling like you want to tell the truth, you want to say how bad it was, how badly you were treated. We're talking about, maybe legal ramifications, maybe like, clinical negligence, things that could get this teacher or this center in trouble. And I'm also worried that, well, so I guess one question is about that. Like, is there kind of mandatory reporting if you report something that is like, you know, against the law or like some sort of official violation of something? Are you gonna do something about it? Um, and also like the details of my story are so specific. Like it happened on this date with this teacher at this center. Like if that ever got published, it would be so clear that it was me. So, how are you going to protect me from that? So that's my first question.
This has come up a couple of times. One, so is there mandatory reporting that's connected to this? Well, because of the anonymity, because we actually don't know whose responses come from anybody, we would not know who to report or how, right? So that is just and that's something that we set out very like at the early start, at the early design of the study. Um, we want people to feel like whatever they say, right, they don't have to worry about repercussions. Um, I mean, there's other conversations we can have about, whether or not you might choose to report in a different venue, but this is not the venue to share about something that is a mandatory reporting situation. I'll also say we have some longitudinal components. We have the FABLA piece. That is not the venue. That's not the place to share something, to share, for example, if you're having thoughts of harming yourself. The reason is we don't get that information until far later. We only look at our data afterwards, and it would be really too late for us to know what was happening to anybody. So if you're in a crisis, if you're having an emergency, this is not a way to let anybody know about it just because we won't get that information sometimes for, weeks or months after the fact. So we can't get that either. Um, the issue with personal identifiable kind of, we don't include your name, but aren't there other ways that we could identify you? There's a couple of things that I think are important to know. One is as we take people's narratives or transcripts or whatever stories they upload, we actually, as that goes into our data bank, which gets locked, we take a very close read of everything. And if something looks like it could potentially be identified, a center name, a set of dates, a location, we would just censor that out. So that does not get retained in our records. This is also true for the interviews. There are also places, so there are places where we put some of the more sensitive stuff toward the end of the survey. So, for example, we ask about your zip code, optionally, because it's important for us to know how people's responses, like basically access to resources, access to support networks, different kinds of like, availability in different states of different supports can vary. So we want to know about that. But we put it at the end because once you've given us all of the information that you've given, you can decide whether you want us to have that information or not, essentially. Um,
And then my final question is, so there are two arms. There's a meditation arm and a psychedelic arm. And for cases like Rachel Peterson or all these other ones that we've been talking about, like, do they need to pick one and just do the one that came first? Then they do both? Like, how does that work?
We ask that you only do one, because we don't want sort of double reporting in our data. But I would think of like, where do you think it started? At the end of the day, we're going to ask you about very, 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 very similar things. So, is really two routes to kind of share about your experience. But for example, in Rachel Peterson's story, right? So she frames it as a response to a bad trip, right? So even though meditation was a part of it, if I was talking to her, I would say probably the psychedelic arm is where you would go, because that's what came first, right? That's where for you and the way you experienced it, that was the precipitating factor. Um, that's the yeah,
Okay, so only do one, but you should also know that the meditation arm also asked about psychedelic use,
yes.
and like whether that was an influencing factor. And there's also, lots of room for qualitative input, in your own words to add factors. And the same thing with the psychedelic arm is that there's plenty of room in there, or we asked specifically about meditation and how that impacted the experience. So it won't be lost if you it'll be we try to cover that double association. I mean, you're bringing up a ton of good points, and I think that, you know, we should keep talking, and Cheetah House is a good place for that. And I think, to some extent, Cheetah House is a bridge for like working out all the rage and betrayal and all that, and then like formulating a coordinated plan as to how to give feedback. Um, and I don't know if Roman, you have other thoughts about how this study is going to play a role. I mean, it's pretty early on. I think today we're just trying to tell you about the study and recruit, but I think, yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think that there are two very brief things that I'll say. One is it's definitely one of our aims to use this as a platform to, first of all, Willoughby has made a first do no harm training that is like, at least for me, it's a model. And I think in the psychedelics arm, we want to do something very similar. But the way, we don't want to come across, people ask us in the screeners all the time, what's your stance? What's your like orientation here? Are you trying to like shut people down? And our stance is that we want to help folks who are struggling. And hopefully that's something that these organizations and us can agree on. And therefore, getting buy-in at these early stages and understanding like, hey, listen, we are just really trying to help all of us do a better job in as stewards, or as folks who are kind of going through the process. Um, so I think getting buy-in at early stages can help later when we have the data to sort of hold all of us accountable. You raised 2 points. One is about the sort of those so-called risk factors, right? That's why we want people like you to participate in the study, right? The way that we learn this, we just published a case study of somebody who had these related to psychedelics. This person had absolutely none of the things that you would usually see as like risk factors. This was a very successful person, over 65, had a very well established career. No, like just everything was sort of like a like least risk category. And they had these profound challenges. And the way you break out of those narratives is you hear from people with that kind of an experience, right? So we will ask you questions about it and just yeah, tell us exactly what you told us. The other is we do try to separate out the actual experience of, for example, a hallucination or an illusion, right? And whether or not it was challenging. And that is, so we do want to know. So, for example, for you, right, maybe there was one point when it was a challenge, and then you kind of figured out a way to make it not so much of an issue. Another person in your shoes might be surprised to find that they're having these sort of hallucinations, right? And we want to kind of again know whether how prevalent this is among challenges, what the issues are, so that at least that person can then be prepared, for example. Yeah.
I'll just add that if you go to my Brown website, the very first paper that I wrote from the VC study was on meditation-induced visual hallucinations. And there's a whole like neurobiology of that. So I checked that out. Definitely. I mean, I think we're looking at, a whole range of well-documented kind of dynamics that happen in groups, and that there's previously existing data and scales measuring like the existence of kind of known dynamics and factors. So yes.
Well, before that, I think
Oh,
I do need to sign off. But I
okay.
really want to say thank you. Thanks to Willoughby, thanks to Cheetah House, and thank you so much for, to everybody here for coming with your questions. Please feel free to email me with any questions that you have. My email is right up on the Emory website. And also it's my name. It's roman.palitsky@emory.edu. I'm just available to anybody who has questions about the study. All right. Thank
I'll try to hold it down while you're gone. We'll see how well I do, but thanks, Roman. I think all of that, what he said, it's rolling out in the next couple months. It's really just about various countries have like the institutional review board. Yeah. And the regulations of each country have different hurdles to go through. And so we're doing the easier ones first. Fill out the screener. And like, I think it says like, what country do you live in? Like, if you qualify, then like when the UK becomes available to recruit, they'll send you an email. So statistically speaking, you can't like peek at the data because then it it counts as asking the question more than once. So yeah, we're not allowed to do that. So basically, I mean, and also different data will be available sooner than like the quantitative data is basically already generated into numbers. Like it's already ready to go once it's like, so that will be easy to analyze. The qualitative data, having done that, I mean, that's what took so long, is coding all that data twice. That's going to take a while. So I would think that when the study is concluded in terms of the target 800, then the analysis can start then. It might be before 3 years are over, depending on how quickly we can recruit people. But in terms of publishing interim data, I mean, I can check with Roman, but I'm pretty confident that that's not something we're doing because it jeopardizes our ability to say that we had a pre-registered hypothesis. And so it's a statistical thing. I mean, participants get paid, which is pretty unusual. And so that's the first one. And, I think beyond that, we're actually not allowed to say that there are definitely any benefits. But we might say that some people feel like they contributed to science. Some people feel like they, got to speak up on behalf of their own experience or spoke their truth to power as a group, as a culture that, this is an underreported, understudied phenomenon that we still don't know that much about, and we definitely don't know how to prevent it or fix it. We haven't, but that's a great idea. I think that we really prioritize the privacy and confidentiality. So, maybe we could have a, completely opt-in, self-referred, support group at Cheetah House for people who are in the study or something like that. So what I would do is just start with the screener. When you get to the interview, just the like online screener, you can ask them then, because you're going to have a 15-minute conversation because you have to prove that you're not a robot. You can ask them then what you should do and if you qualify for that. So it's something that like it's written right into the procedure of the study that it will figure it out for you if you qualify for the other one. So in creating this survey, I really wanted to get at a lot of the elements that I was, had subsequently learned about at Cheetah House. Like what people were telling me was like, the sort of problem areas, and the social dynamics were like, how do you study that? And so I actually spent maybe several years reading the literature on sexual assault, because there's a big parallel there in that the nature of the sexual assault is actually not the predictor of PTSD. It's how people are responding to women who are claiming to have been assaulted. It's the police force, it's the, it's the clinicians, it's the family. It's like, so I got really interested in that. And then I found I got a grant from the Center for Institutional Courage, which is led by Jennifer Freyd, and she studies the rape culture, basically the dynamics around sexual assault. And she created, she studies all of that kind of dynamics, and she created a scale called the Institutional Betrayal and Support Questionnaire. And then that was the scale. So that was a very generic scale that looked at like the way that institutions who are supposed to be helping institutions, like medical, like schools and medical facilities and things like that, how they are actually contributing to betrayal trauma through harming people that they're supposed to be protecting. So she created the scale, but then that's the scale that we did community-based participatory research on it. We're like, based on like what in addition to these like, basic questions that are kind of like generic institutional betrayal, like what are the special ones that show up in Buddhism and meditation centers? So we have those. I'm hoping that gets at some of what you're talking about. You asked some questions about, power and gender and, cultural like incompatibilities and things like that. But that's why we have the qualitative elements too, because like we tried to get at everything, but there's like literally 1,000 questions. And it was like, at some point we just need to be like, we're not going to get everything. Please add your own voice. So I think let me know. Like, I think that we got to those. That's a really important piece that you're talking about. And it was one that I really tried to get in there. Okay, well, I hope you will consider participating. I really wish I could participate, but obviously that would be a conflict of interest. Yeah, I'm really excited about the study. I think we did a really good job. Or I think we tried to really cover a lot of bases. And I think that the data that comes out of this will really move the field forward in a really, really critical way. So thank you so much for attending. And yeah, I hope you participate. Thanks.